We're going to have, oh, do you want me to go over that again, Rob?
I'm going to record the first part. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So today we're going to be covering, welcome back to day 2 of the LGBTQ History Institute. Today we're going to be covering some strategies on how to think about incorporating LGBTQ content into your curriculum. We're going to be going over a resource. We're going to have a primary source activity, and we're going to have a teacher panel for folks that have already done this within their classrooms, so that you can ask some questions about how they've dealt with situations, how they've incorporated it into their curriculum and to their pedagogy. And yeah, I guess we should just get started. And so, just like yesterday and every time that we meet for this institute, we'd like to honor the land from which this is originating from. So I'd like to acknowledge that this virtual meeting is originating in Sacramento, California, on traditional and unceded tribal land of the Nisenan people. I pay my respect to elders both past and present. And again, to reiterate from yesterday, the reason that we do this is to recognize that in order for us to move forward, we have to understand our past, which is basically why we learn history in the first place. That if we're going to right the wrongs, if we're going to improve our society, we have to understand the conditions by which we are here today. And that means acknowledging the harm that might have been done for us to be here today. And so in that spirit, and in the spirit of making our future better, we honor that. I myself coming to you from Ramayta Ohlone land here in San Francisco, and honor those folks as well. So real quick with the next 2 slides, One Archives is co-presenting with us at Our Family Coalition, and that's that. All right, so an overview again of the things that the frameworks say. This is the floor from which we should be starting of what we should be covering in history, 2nd, 4th, 5th, 8th, 11th, and 12th grades. Again, family diversity in 2nd, gender during the California Gold Rush, Charlie Parkhurst, westward movement in 5th with 2-spirit native traditions, 8th grade with the 14th Amendment and the Constitution, gender in the westward movement, enslaved life and families, gender during the Civil War for 8th. 11th grade, we've got World War II and enlistment, the Harlem Renaissance, the Lavender Scare, laws and court cases, the AIDS epidemic, and the LGBT rights movement. In 12th grade, we go into laws and court cases and Supreme Court case decisions. Anything from the sodomy laws that were defeated in Texas in the early 2000s to marriage equality as it exists today. All the different court cases that came into fruition to have those things happen.
Could I comment on that, Rick?
You have a comment?
Yeah. So just so everybody knows, we focus on the things that are in the history social science framework, because to us, that's the low-hanging fruit, right? The framework says this is what we're supposed to be teaching.
Right.
Now, as you work on your collections, if you want to branch out to one of these other categories or something beyond this, you're welcome to, but just keep thinking about where it fits in to the framework and into your regular teaching. So I just wanted to point that out as we continue talking.
Right. Thank you for that.
And one more thing, for those of you who teach 11th or 12th grade, you know, June, the end of June is the most exciting time for people who follow the Supreme Court, because in case you didn't know it, Supreme Court decisions always are explained and decided on mostly at the end of June. So for those of us in the LGBTQ community in 2015, we were excited the last day of June when Obergefell v. Hodges was decided at that point. So I just bring that to your attention, because if you follow the Supreme Court at all, the end of June is an exciting time, and they continue to release their decisions on different topics. Now, enough of that history lesson for now.
Thank you, Rob. Right, and to Rob's point, again, this is the floor, not the ceiling. This is where we should be starting. So if your school, you're teaching, your own curriculum isn't here yet, this is where it should be, so that we can go beyond this. All right, and again, no shame about not having it there. That's the reason we have this institute. Nobody has learned this up until this point or created learning resources around it. were robust enough for a large mass of teachers to be able to do this together. And so again, this is why we're here, right? Same thing as introducing any new types of ways of thinking or curriculum. There has to be a lot of training involved. So no guilt, just move forward. Okay, so we're going to go over some strategies for teaching LGBTQ history and social science. I want you to think about the activity that we did yesterday with the digital dig, and think about all of the different things that you found on all those different websites that could be used for the specific topic that you're looking for, or could be used for any of the other related topics that you teach throughout the year, because that's going to be important in how we are able to navigate how we are creating these resources in the future. I'm gonna switch from the slideshow now. And what I'm gonna do, and this is again something that Rob doesn't like doing, but it is one of the only ways to do this, is to show you the Teaching LGBTQ History website. And the reason, if you didn't notice, that we're going over this one is because we know it pretty intimately, because both our Family Coalition and our One Archives co-run the site. So on top of the One Archives resource, with the lesson plans and panels, they also can be found here along with other things. And so I don't know if the reason we're going over this as well is because we know that you probably look through a lot of this site, but there might be some tips and tricks that you might have missed. And so the first thing I wanna go over is the menu bar here. Of course, the lesson plans are in here. You've got the lesson plans. They've been divided in two different categories. Well, 2 categories and 3 grade levels, right? Which ends up with 6 things. It's going to end up with 7 because there will be supplemental lesson plans. Within the next month, we're going to put in supplemental lesson plans, but we'll talk about these for now. And so at the top, we've got elementary, middle, and high school for history frameworks. All of the lesson plans that are within these categories are going to have lesson plans that have to do with things that are specifically said within the frameworks. And so if you go into the Lavender Menace, the shifting gender roles, the AIDS epidemic, what caused the Black Tavern riots, you click on any of them. Let's just click on the Lavender Menace here. You can see the different history framework parts and where they are in the framework. So for example, history framework chapter 16, page 419, you'll see why this is relevant there. Speaking of which, oh no, I'm getting ahead of myself. And so those are the lesson plans around the frameworks. Of course, we know that the frameworks, again, is the floor, not the ceiling. And so when we're talking about the lesson plans, we have this second category, which is general LGBTQ. And so these lesson plans also have LGBTQ content to them, but it's not specifically mentioned within the frameworks. This is also where you're going to find things like once we make it more robust, our world history resources, because that technically is not within the Fair Education Act law, right? Earlier you saw that I went into a lesson plan and there were a bunch of keywords at the top. Actually, I can just do that right now. You can, and so legacy of the civil rights movement. You can see there are lesson tags here: 11th grade, 1960s, 1970s, activism, civil rights, gender politics. If you click on any of these, you'll find all the other lesson plans that relate to that particular tag. And so, for example, all the lesson plans that have to do specifically with women, you click on that and you can see all of the different lesson plans, no matter what grade level, no matter whether they are frameworks or not, here. Now, that is one way you can do it. The other way is if you go up to lesson plans, you go to keywords. This gets a little clunky, but it's the best we could do for right now. You can click on the keywords and you can see the tags and you can say, all right, I'm teaching this grade level. Let's go see what's available for that, right? And then it will take you to all of the different lesson plans that are for that. California standards, if you're teaching through the standards, right, looking for a specific thing that you want to teach through. We've got the Common Core standards up at top. We've got the history social science standards And we've got the history frameworks with the different things that are mentioned throughout the framework around LGBT history here, right? And so if we wanted to, for example, do this, then we'd see that there is a lesson plan about Charlie Parkhurst and the Westward Movement that meets that particular history framework stipulation. All right. The other thing I want to show is, and this is within the documents that were shared with you, the textbook evaluation tools. And I mentioned this a little bit yesterday. If your school is in the middle of adopting books, or you've already adopted a book and want to see how well it meets the frameworks and the standards, with regards to LGBT issues, then you have these great alignment tools here. And so you can see there's one for K through 5, one for 8th grade, one for 11th grade. I'm going to click on the 8th grade one. It's really great. Rob created these really easily Rob created these to be easily navigable, I should say, where you can see what the essential questions. And if you're wondering where we got the framework for this, a team of folks, including our Family Coalition and a few other LGBTQ organizations, when the textbooks were being evaluated for California, we created a sub-team to read every single book from cover to cover and see how they covered LGBTQ history. And so technically there is a rating that we have for each of the different textbooks out there. We don't give it out because each school's needs are different about what they might need within their school. Some textbooks are better with what they offer for teacher resources. Some are better for what content they have within the textbooks themselves. Some are better in other ways. And so we didn't want to make that determination for you if you found one more useful. But in any case, this was the matrix that we used to see if it was meeting the standards. And so you have the essential questions, you have the framework references here, so you know where those essential questions came from. And then Rob made it really convenient with this rating system. He's put in the particular part of the framework that you might refer to here. You can put your own rating, right? If you're doing this as a group within your school to evaluate the books, you can each have one of these sheets, rate it yourself, and have comments about why each of those things rated the way that you wanted. And then at the end, you can go, all right, we're going to go with this book, or we're not based off of these particular things. And so that's our textbook alignment tool on the website.
As Rick's leaving that, let me just say that textbook alignment tool integrates in the curriculum alignment, the curriculum calendar, other documents that you have. But you can not only use this for textbooks, but for the content to teach at each of your grade levels. And this is the only document that kind of does both, but you can only name it one thing at a time.
Right. I see in the chat, there's a question about the Texas textbooks. Thank you, Carolyn. Yes, it is a full-time job. It took us a lot of time to analyze the California textbooks. And you should know that with these matrices, and the Department of Education did agree with us that there was one textbook company that did not hit the criteria and they cannot be sold within California because of that, right? And so these criteria really matter for how they're going to be, how you should be looking at what should be within your textbooks. All right. The next thing, you want me to name names. Rob, can I do that?
No, I don't think it's wise to do that,
Okay.
because those textbook companies have updated their textbooks since that time.
Okay.
And it's really up to individual schools and school districts to make that decision on their own. You've got the textbook alignment tools, you apply them, you learn about it yourself, you decide what is best to teach your students in your school district.
Thank you for that, Rob. See, this is why I have to check. All right. So And of course, we know that we are not the holders of all history or the holders of all pedagogy around LGBTQ issues. And so we want to hear from you. If you've got a great lesson plan, please submit your lesson plan and then we can put it up on the site. If you've already got it on a school resource, we know, for example, that there are teachers in San Diego Unified that have created really, really great lesson plans around LGBTQ history, then we can credit the school as well, or the district that is providing them, and you, because we want to give you credit for creating these things. And so please, if you've got something that you know works, share it with us. All right, next thing is our resources. And so one of the first things in here that's really important is the LGBTQ rights timeline in American history. And so if you were wondering, hey, where can I fit these different topics around gender or sexuality within the curriculum that I'm already doing, this is a great resource to see where within history they might fit. All right. Granted, this is for the Fair Education Act, and so it's all going to be US history that is in here. If we do have time and energy, we will try to include other things within the future. But just know that this is here while you're creating your curriculum for the year. Now, speaking of creating curriculum, there are lots of different resources on top of our lesson plan that we refer to. So we can't create all of it, clearly. And so we've got our resources, aids, and tools here. All of these different websites have different things that can give you either primary or secondary resources or other places for that you can get different resources like other lesson plans or content. And so at the top, we've got fee-for-service resources right now. The only one we've got there is History Under Race. They're a really great organization out of the East Coast. They worked with the New York Department of Education to create a pay-for-service resource. And so that's something that you can consider. I mean, but there's also us as well. And then, of course, all of the different things that that you can go to for those. Here at the LGBTQ primary resources, you can see One Archives, Lambda Archives, all the different archives of LGBT things that we've found. If you find more, again, please, 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 you know, we can't keep our tabs on everything. Let us know so that we can put it up on here and help other teachers like yourself. Lastly, I know that, or for this tab at least, I know that learning is a process that is different for lots of different people. I've got a lot of different video and resources that you can also access here. And so if your students are ones that want an audio component, a really great podcast is Making Gay History. We've highlighted 3 that we think are particularly good for fitting into the frameworks. Other podcasts are things like History is Gay. I would say for that one, not necessarily for use in the classroom, that's for your own education, right? Queer America, Teaching Tolerance. Earlier, yesterday, we talked about Dr. John Emilio, and I think I might have mentioned Layla Rupp, but they now have a podcast. This is basically another technical course on how to teach LGBT history. And so all of these different things, you can find videos that you might be able to use in your classroom. And again, great ways to incorporate and advance your own learning around that. And then I saw questions yesterday, and so normally I wouldn't be showing this, but I saw questions yesterday around learning more about the history of the Fair Education Act. Well, we've got the Fair Education Act timeline here, and so that short history that I shared, the only thing that's missing is the actual idea creation around it. That was in 2001, but you have the timeline here if you want to do a lesson about how you do change through policy and then practice within your classrooms, right? Using this as the particular model. So that is available. Finally, we've got our trainings. And so if you find that what you're learning is really great and you could use support for teaching your colleagues at your schools, you can reach out to Rob, Eric, and I through this form. And tell us, right, what kind of training that you need. Is it teacher, administrator, family advocate? where your organization's from, and then just give us a message. What is it you're exactly looking for? We have some templates for particular things that we teach around content, but when it comes to things like SEL, at least for our family coalition, we really tailor it for the needs of the school. So that's another thing to know. Are there any questions while we're on this webpage? Okay, seeing none. All right. And then if there's anything, now that you've seen me go through our webpage and how to navigate that with things, if there are any like tips or tricks or things that you found through the other websites, feel free to either raise your hand so you can share them by talking about it, or share it within the chat, or within your collections that we'll be sharing with each other at the end, put them in there. All right. Is there anything else you want to add, Rob? Okay, great. So let's get on with the presentation. All right, which means, okay. So here's, oh, wow, okay. I'll go as fast as I can. So when we are talking about LGBT history, one of the things that we have to think about is that throughout time, the way that we've talked about gender and sexuality expansiveness has differed. And so we want to make sure that we're talking about people in the right way. And so right here, we have a picture of Sylvia Rivera in front of a sign for the organization that she started or helped started, the Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. And so the first thing that we want to put forth is that we want to use terms that were popular for the time. We don't want to apply modern identities. And the reason for that is because there might have been a lack of vocabulary at the time, but that doesn't mean that it's okay to impose our vocabulary on them. They might have had a different understanding. We might have a different interpretation of who they are because we're not in that time period. We're not experiencing what they're experiencing. And so, right, the word transvestite is a term that we don't use anymore. We know that there is a derogatory connotation to it and a denotation to it that is derogatory, that doesn't actually describe the community, but it is the word that was chosen for the time. Judge for yourself the maturity of your classroom and whether you can talk about it as a word that is locked in time versus a word that they're going to abuse as a derogatory word. This is the same for other words that might be less controversial to use nowadays. For example, queer. I use that pretty liberally, but depending, again, on my audience and how I know they might abuse it or use it, I might not use that word, right? But the takeaway is, do not use terms that they would not have used for themselves, okay? Next thing is, ask if this person were alive today, how might they identify? And so this is a little bit of, okay, don't put a label on somebody, but you can open the door of, if this person was alive today, might they identify as, right? This way you can open it up for the students to think about, oh, the times were different and how they approached this subject matter was different at that time period. What were their opportunities to express themselves and be able to articulate that in a public space? If they were alive today, would this be a possibility that is open? And this way we don't erase the possibility and the possibility of the queer history that is there, and we respect that person for who they were remembered as, right? To the right, and the reason I use this example is because Sally Ride, one, is a very well-known astronaut, right? Had a romantic partner over 27 years, but never in public said that she was a lesbian. Yesterday, somebody said, some of the other possibilities for somebody is that they could be pansexual, that they could be bisexual or demisexual, or any of these other identities. And so for us, because we know her partner at the time was a woman, to say that she was a lesbian might be going a little too far. We don't know, because she never said so. And there are too many other possibilities of what that might have been, right? And Rob, just so you know, I did get your note. Next thing is, then how do we talk about these figures? Well, give descriptions about how their life was lived rather than applying labels. And so yesterday we talked about Charlie Parkhurst, and right, we know that Charlie Parkhurst was a stagecoach driver. We know that he moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. We know that upon death that Charlie was found to have a stereotypical female anatomy, right? But we don't know how Charlie identified. Is there a possibility that today, again, with the previous point, that Charlie might have identified as a transgender man? Maybe, but if you look at the epitaph on the memorial for Charlie Parkhurst, noted whip of the gold rush days, drove stagecoach over Mount Madonna in early days of the valley, last run San Juan to Santa Cruz, death in cabin near the 7 Mile House, revealed one-eyed Charlie, a woman, the first woman to vote in the US, November 3rd, 1868. This is the reason we don't want to make assumptions about who this person was. There was no confirmation first. Second, if Charlie dressed as a man at the time because there was no social mobility, right? And felt that this was the way to gain agency within his life, then we don't want to take away from the story that this was a woman that really made some headway into being able to run his own life. The reason I keep using his, by the way, is because we know for a fact that during life, Charlie used he, him, his as his pronouns. And so to respect that, we continue to use it, regardless of whether we open it up to the possibility that it might have been a woman dressing up as a man or a transgender man, right? We want to keep those possibilities open. The question is, so would it be incorrect to refer to anyone as being transgender historically? Definitively, we cannot say, right? We cannot definitively say this person was transgender. We can say this person is part of transgender history, that gender expansiveness fits within that category, if that makes sense. All right. So I think this is the last of these slides. We also, the last part is acknowledge the importance of exploring the factors that would have influenced the decision these historical figures made. And if you have a question about this, we already do this with culture, religion, marriage, status, all those kinds of things, right? So to the right, we have Baird Rustin. As many of us know, he was a confidant and consultant for Martin Luther King, was the person who planned the March on Washington. And up until maybe 20 years ago at the earliest, we didn't really know about his involvement with the civil rights movement. And so we have to ask ourselves, did it matter that he was Black and gay? Did it matter that he had open relationships? Did it matter that the public at the time considered these things deviant and abominations, right? Did that inform his work around the civil rights movement? Yes or no, right? Because we know that all of these different factors, as we were talking about yesterday, can be motivators, demotivators, and can affect how somebody might navigate the situation that they're in history. All right, so I'm going to now pass it over to the next folks. Oh boy.
Before we get there, I'll let Rick transition if we can go back to stop sharing so we can look at people.
Oh yeah, sure.
I just want to comment to everybody here to let you know that I don't totally agree with those aspects that Rick just shared. And Olivia, who you're going to hear from, doesn't necessarily agree with all those aspects either, because there's not any general educational direction or academic direction on what you call people in LGBTQ history. I think most of us could agree that we could say they were part of the LGBTQ community if there was one. Or you heard Rick use the term queer. We're all pretty comfortable using the word queer. If you read any historians who've written, the term queer is the term they all use. So queer is certainly acceptable to say Charlie Parkhurst could be considered part of the queer community. But you could use that broader question, and then whatever students say, like with Sally Ride, they said, well, would she be considered a lesbian? And you could say, Well, that's one aspect that you could bring forward. Now I'm going to push back about what does public mean, right? Because nobody's proven this one way or the other. You know, if I was at a party with Sally Ride and her partner, she would have introduced her partner as her partner. To me, that's public. She would have been admitting that she's a lesbian. Okay. But, you know, public, some people say public has to be published in a newspaper. Anyway, those are things to think about. The other thing to note on that Charlie Parkhurst placard that Rick showed, notice it was erected in 1955. Okay. You know, that was the mindset in 1955. So things have gotten better and we've learned a lot more. So just know that language is always changing and we continue to have these discussions. The important part for every teacher is to identify for yourself how you're going to, what you're going to name it. If you're going to talk about Sally Ride in third grade, you're not going to go, you don't have the time, right? To talk about, well, Sally Ride had a partner. Now, do you know what having a partner means, right? You just don't have time to go into all those every time. So you just have to know how you're going to be expressing those when you teach it at your grade level. So I would encourage you to think about how the terms you want to use and how it's going to work best with your students. And with that, I'm happy to introduce you to our teacher panel today. And let me get them on here and spotlight them so that we're all, where are they? So where are you? Here is Chris and Olivia and Oliver. Let me get Oliver in here. Where are you? There we go. Add to the spotlight. There we go.
I love that we have two Ollies in the house.
Yeah, I know it, you know, and we almost had another person named Chris. So it's going to be Chris's and Ollie's that could share about this. So anyway, so hopefully you are all viewing this and we are recording this part. I hope that's okay with all of you. So we'll do this recording for the rest of this section and then stop after that. So I gave Chris, Olivia, and Oliver some questions to think about. So I'll just read them off. If you have other questions you want to ask them, then you can put it in the chat and I'll ask them for you as well. So why don't we just start with each of you introducing yourselves. We'll start with Chris and then go to Olivia and then Oliver.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Bautista, he, him, his pronouns. I teach in Oakland, California, in terms of my teaching experience. I've taught 9th grade English and Ethnic Studies. In the fall, I'll be teaching 10th grade English and Law and Society, which deals with a lot of institutional oppression, which is going to be fun to talk about. I've also taught gender inclusive sex education, and I also act as the LGBT site lead over at my school. So that's exciting. Lots of good stuff.
Hi, my name is Olivia. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I like to say too that I am an LGBTQ person, identify as a non-binary lesbian. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask me at another time. I always remind people, I know you might have questions about my identity, but that's not the place for this right now. So feel free to email me. But I teach in Bakersfield, California. I see some of my people here, which I love. I always love when I see my people in good old Bakersfield, because I know we're fighting the good fight over here. I teach AVID and world history. So any of you world history teachers, we all know the struggle of teaching world history. And I'm hoping to give you some insight onto how you can use LGBTQ curriculum in a world history class. And then I love the question that Rob asked us, which is, why are you a teacher? I'm a teacher because I love working with students and creating relationships through curriculum and history. I love history specifically because it gives me an opportunity as an adult and an educator to have really important conversations with my students about the past and how it relates to the present. And it really gives me an opportunity to talk about some of the most important themes in just life in general with structure. I love the structure of history. And I'm really excited to talk to all of you today about teaching LGBTQ history. I just posted a resource guide that I've made in the chat if anybody wants to check that out. It's a Google slide with active links on it. And I actually have a whole slide on there about the language we can use to talk about people in the past, if anyone wants to check that out. And I got that from Don Romsberg, who is an amazing LGBTQ history professor. And he gave me some really great advice on that. And so I suggest you check that out if that's one of your big questions.
Wow, I feel overwhelmed with my fellow panelists and how cool they are. My name is Oliver. I use he, they pronouns. I'm calling in from the little pea patch in the backyard of my Seattle apartment. I got connected to the One Archive folks and Rob a couple of years ago doing this institute. And so I'm really happy to be here on the panel. So I teach at a school called Hamlin Robinson. I teach 8th grade humanities, so history and ELA for students with dyslexia. Next year I'll be changing schools, but that's what I've been doing for the past couple of years. Why am I a teacher? Huge question. I think education is a huge part of the process of socializing folks and folks' socialization, and I'm pretty invested in the project of revitalizing art history and revitalizing the stories we tell ourselves and ultimately the cultures in which we are trying to imagine for ourselves as liberational. And I think history is a huge part of that. So yeah, I guess I'm a teacher also because I absolutely love laughing with kids all day. And I am a joyous child, and being a teacher helps me continue that, that legacy. And yeah, I'm just really excited to talk to y'all today. I'm in the middle of a bunch of drama up here in Seattle regarding Pride. I do a lot of community organizing with the Seattle Democratic Socialists of America, which I'm one of the elected leaders. And so queer topics and queerness is obviously very on all of our brains, and the intersections of that and the Black community and Black liberation and the sort of erasure of that history within LGBTQ history is really important to me. And how that manifests contemporarily. How are these historical dynamics playing out in, who's organizing Pride, who's sort of defining our cultural institutions and moments and events. So, I like to think historically, but I also like to think how is history and power playing out right now, and messing with that a little bit. I almost dropped an F-bomb, but it's summer, so let me, please. That's it. I'm gonna stop.
All right, next question for all of you is, think about when you taught your very first LGBTQ plus history lesson. How did it go? Were you nervous? How did you deal with that? And was there any response from your students? Who wants to jump in?
I can jump in. So I've been teaching since I was 18 in one way or another, but I taught preschool. I was a graduate teaching assistant, and but my second year in teaching high school. So I had lots of teaching experience, but not necessarily teaching full-time in a high school. And Aleda Rojas, who's in the room, and I were on this really great curriculum building team, and we talked a lot about complicating the curriculum. And so we didn't talk as much about LGBTQ people the first summer that we did it, but it really encouraged me to create a lesson. So what I did is I went through the framework, and I teach world history. So those of you who teach world history know the struggle. There's only one place that it's in there, which was the Holocaust. And I didn't really love the idea of teaching it the only time doing that. So I had already taught some social emotional stuff revolving around LGBTQ people, but it was the first time I'll say that it was in the curriculum. It was a full lesson, and it was inclusive of other people too. We talked about the Holocaust and people with disabilities and other groups as well. And so I decided that I was going to do it. And I did a lot of research, created a lesson with primary sources, and I decided to make it literacy based so that my administrators couldn't really say what you want, but I'm teaching literacy. And that's kind of always been my method, by the way. When you teach LGBTQ history, it's always great to make sure that it's a good lesson. You shouldn't be teaching a crappy lesson that just happens to have LGBTQ people in it. I was very nervous. Like I said, I'm an LGBTQ person. I live in Bakersfield. At the time, I was only out to a few people at work, and none of them were admin and none of them were in my department. And I knew that doing this was going to be at great personal and professional risk to me. But I knew that it was the right thing to do. And despite not having tenure, I was like, I'm going to do it anyways. And what got me through it really was because I had a lot of anxiety, and I have an anxiety disorder. I'll just put that out there. So I have a lot of anxiety about everything, but it was extra. Like I was sweating and just very nervous. But I kept reminding myself that my students deserve to see themselves in this curriculum, and that I didn't get that. And that's part of the reason why I feel so nervous right now. That's part of the reason I feel nervous about talking about this, is because I've never been in a classroom where anyone's talked about this before. So I felt really nervous. And I was kept thinking about, as a teacher, you're the leader in the classroom, and you decide what stories are important to tell and what stories aren't important to tell. Really, that's what you're communicating to your students. So I was like, you know what? Enough's enough. I'm going to do it. And it went incredibly well. Honestly, the first time I did it, I didn't have any backlash. I didn't have any issues. I had a couple students come up to me after class, and this is one of my favorite memories in teaching. I'll try not to get a little emotional, but they came up to me and said that it was the first time in a classroom they had ever heard a teacher even use the word gay or talk about gay people. And that even though the topic was sad, I made sure to talk about activism after the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors fighting for the right to be heard as Holocaust survivors and not as prisoners. And so my students said, I was really empowered by this. Like, it empowered me that our people have struggled, and that despite that struggle, despite being a Holocaust survivor who, the man that we were talking about was Pierre Seal, who was a Holocaust survivor put in jail after the Holocaust, that he then went in the end of his life and spent the end of his life advocating for LGBTQ people. And they asked me to help advise the Pride Club. And I was like, whoa, this is big. This is a lot in one day. And I haven't stopped since then, because I realized that, for those queer kids in the classroom, this isn't just academic. Like, I'm having an academic conversation about LGBTQ history with my cis straight students, but for my students who aren't, or my students who are questioning, or who come from diverse families, this conversation is really big. And so that's one thing that I kind of took away from my first time teaching it, was that this is a big conversation. Prepare yourself for big conversations, because they're going to happen. So it was awesome for me. I got to start a Pride Club after that.
Oliver, then Chris.
Wow, thank you for all that, Olivia. That was really thoughtful, and I definitely shared a lot of the anxiety of doing this, despite being in a pretty accepting sort of stereotypical Seattle liberal bubble. Don't get me wrong, Seattle is not a progressive city. But anyway, I guess, so I first started teaching, I was a student teacher, and I was taking over classes for a US history teacher for 8th grade. Again, all my students have dyslexia. I say that because I'm constantly in the struggle of finding texts that are appropriate for my students, but also complex and relevant enough for them where they don't feel like they're, being babied and building their academic confidence. And that's a huge part of my curriculum, is like building my students' academic self-image. So I preface this all with saying that. And I say that because when I first tried to teach queer history as a student teacher, we were doing the turn of the century, Industrial Revolution, urbanization, kind of the end of US history in 8th grade for Washington. I'm not quite, I think it's the same for California. Can I get some head nods? Is that the end of the timeline there for y'all? Kinda, if you make it there, I think is the vibe. But so I went really in. I went way too in. I went into like Magnus Hirschfeld and sexology and the medicalization of like ultimately LGBTQ people and the sort of invention of homosexuality as a term in the sort of end of the 19th century, and how the sort of medicalization was connected to the Industrial Revolution, how that was connected to urbanization, and how urbanization made space for queer identities to flourish, whether it was in the theater, whether it was in clubs, whether it was in bathhouses or YMCAs or various other shows. And so that was a huge unit that sort of looked at the intersections of gender and how gender norms were changing with urbanization and the sort of, moving off the farm and moving out of the sort of religious rural life into the city. And so with those gender changes in the turn of the century, there was this huge rise to sort of police and oppress sexualities and deviant sexualities that were arising at the time. And by arising at the time, I mean, they were becoming more visible in the city, and there were becoming more communities in the cities. So that was a huge thing to dive into with 8th graders, but it was, which is incredibly complicated, but students were incredibly interested. I just think a lot of the texts that I found, and I'll geek here for a second. I'm just going to show people books because I always like to show people books of what I read to teach. Queer America, oh no, my thing is backwards. A People's GLBT History of the United States, very helpful. Rethinking Sexism, Gender and Sexuality by Rethinking Schools is very helpful. I guess this, Making Gay History. A Queer History of the United States for Young People, very good for young readers. This book, I'm sure you might have seen already in this class, Understanding and Teaching U.S. Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender History. And I think, well, this one, but A Queer History of the United States.
And how did the students react when you taught that lesson?
Yeah, sorry, I got distracted, but I wanted to plug those books.
And you did. Now, tell us what those students thought.
Oh, students had the most amazing reaction to learning about LGBTQ history for the first time. A lot of discomfort though, and a lot of like navigating, teenage boys being like, uncomfortable playing around with the words, with the ideas, and having to sort of intervene on some of that. The snickering, the whispers. And I think it's really important to just like make those things known. They all come from discomfort, right? All those straight boys snickering, it comes from a lot of like heteronormativity, and it comes from a lot of ultimately discomfort and unfamiliarity with queerness. And so I like to really make, I'm a pretty loud homosexual in the classroom. And it does help for me to use myself and be vulnerable in those spaces, and it did in that moment. But I guess I'll end with saying, even the most complex subjects in LGBTQ history are so worth exploring with students, and they're not too complicated. And students feel like they feel so much more adult, and they feel like so much more mature when you take these subjects up with them and just say the word gay, right? Gay, 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 normalize it, because students will hesitate. And you want to just like, that's the first hurdle that I found was like, can I say gay? And you're like, it's like those white folks who are like, can I say Mexican? Is that a swear word? And you're like, nah, what? Like, that happens. And so normalizing just the utterance of the word is so important. I'll say that.
Great, Chris.
Yeah, Oliver, I also taught a little bit about industrialization and the kind of the emergence of queer communities from that. I could talk about that later. Let's see. Well, I'll be transparent. So when I went into teaching, so I'm a transgender guy. And I decided to delay my entry into teaching until I had completed like all of the legal stuff and transitioning physically, medically, whatever, because I intended to be not be open as a teacher, because I'm just like, I want to be a teacher. Like this gender history stuff, no one needs to know about it. So then I was kind of doing my thing, and it wasn't until my 3rd year of teaching where there were like LGBT kids in the classroom. And like, I don't know, kids can read you. They're like, oh, that one's one of us. Like, I don't know how they do it. Like, I thought I was hiding it pretty well. And I was asking the kids about it later, and they're like, no, we knew first day. Anyway, so I was teaching.
What grade were you teaching?
8th grade.
Okay.
Was my 3rd year. And there was an incident where like there was one child that came out as trans, or they were trying to kind of figure themselves out, going by another name, another pronoun. Them and I had like kind of had a vulnerable conversation about like kind of the awkwardness being in the classroom. Because like Oliver, I taught humanities, so it was a double block, ELA and history. There's a like you spend a long time together because it's like 2 periods. So you know, it wasn't like open transphobia or anything like that, but it's one of those things where you know how people like ask questions thinking they're being curious, but it's actually like not okay to ask. Like, hey, what's in your pants? Like, no, don't ask that. Um, so like them and I were having this like conversation about like, I'm feeling kind of uncomfortable. Like I know people mean well, but like I don't really know what to do. So what were we doing? We were doing the Civil War at the time. And then I was like, okay, honestly, there was a lot of material I had to cover. I couldn't like pause and be like, hey, let's talk about what transgender means and let's talk about how they exist in society. So for this kid, I did some research about like important LGBT figures during this time. So there's this transgender man named Albert Cashier, and he fought for the Union. He and he was able to live his own like life as a guy during like the mid to late 19th century. Um, and that was kind of an opportunity for me to be like, hey, let's talk about the fact that LGBT people, transgender people have existed in history. You know, like what do you think about that? And there are kids who are like, you know, there's some person that was willing to live their life to fight for what they believed in, and like people were like, oh, that's really cool. And that kind of segued into kind of this social emotional learning opportunity of being like, so he's a guy, right? Like that's who he is, that's how we're referring to him as. Let's apply that to today. So at the end of this conversation, um kids had like, oh, okay, like I understand to a degree as much as a 14-year-old 13 14-year-old can like get it. um and that really helped the class culture. This like the LGBT kids in my class were like, hey, like that was, I didn't know that, like that was really cool. And we were also this kind of, I don't know, I didn't intend this, but the kids started talking about this, about like, hey, why haven't we heard about this person? You know, like, why don't we see these types of people in our history books? So it was a really kind of cool opportunity to um, have the conversation in like a non-weird way about transgender identities without like singling out these kids in my classroom, while also giving kids like a lesson in empathy um, as well. So
And you put it in a history context as well.
yeah, I put in history context. And you know, it went really well. Like with 8th graders, yeah, like with middle schoolers, like it can get kind of weird. I mean, because they're middle schoolers, like they're weird in general, because they're like going through their
Yeah.
puberty and whatever. But when you give them the opportunity to be like self-reflective and really think about like why things are a certain way and you scaffold it, there are some really great conversations that come from that.
So Chris, why don't I follow up with you with this other piece related to that, and then Olivia and Oliver can jump in. So you do that lesson. What was the next lesson you taught? And then did you get any pushback from your students in a negative way, or from parents or administrators? And if you did, how did you handle that?
Like in the context of that specific lesson, or like
Oh,
in
no,
my
well, you said
career?
that was your first lesson. I'm assuming that you now integrate that in, well, or you did integrate that into your ongoing teaching. Did you
Yeah.
integrate other topics in after that? And if so, what were they? And
Um,
if you got any pushback, how did you deal with it?
so in terms of, I'm thinking about my most recent one. So this was with 9th graders. Um, we're, we were learning like World War II. We were focusing on counter narratives in World War II, actually, because I try to do this thing where I don't just integrate like LGBT issues, but also thinking about the idea of intersectionality. But like, let's take a look at other oppressed communities during the specific time period and how do they relate? Because there's a big problem in our society where it's just like, oh, this group has it worse than this group. And then there's a lot of like lateral violence, I guess you could say. There's a lot of infighting um, between oppressed communities as opposed to thinking like we should be calling out those in power and privilege and all this stuff. But anyway, so I was teaching World War II. The focus was on counter narratives and looking at, why are we so obsessed with World War II as a society? Why do we have so many movies on World War II, but we don't see movies about Rosie the Riveters? We don't see movies about like that focus on like an LGBT person during World War II. It's always like the same white dudes fighting in Europe or whatever, you know. But anyway, so I actually got this lesson during one of the trainings. There was a training here about World War II and LGBT history. Totally stole that. But anyway, so
Good.
yeah, great resources from this org.
I made that.
No, oh, you made that.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you.
I was about to say,
Anyway.
wow, it sounds really familiar. I think I've taught this lesson before.
Anyway, so I
Please,
expanded
I
it.
encourage everyone to steal it.
Yeah.
So this is where I brought in like the industrialization and been like, okay, so this is what happened first, the formation of cities, kind of the first time LGBT people were like, oh, there's other people like me. That's cool. And then World War II happened. And we really looked at primary sources. And one of the things I really wanted to emphasize was like the individual correspondence that people had with each other. So when you're talking about like African American, Rosie the Riveters, for instance, we really looked at like we looked at like interviews of these folks because, as a guy, like I'm not gonna know, like I can't be speaking for these populations. So I try to give as many opportunities for students to like read the actual voices of these people. But anyway, so it was actually Valentine's Day when I taught this. So we looked at love letters between soldiers during World War II. And I don't know if there was like any academic merit to it. I was just like, I just want to read love letters, everyone. Like, this is cute. So there was, yes, literacy. Exactly. I was like, okay, everyone, it's Valentine's Day. If you're going to write a love letter, like, here's an example. We're going to look at modeling. But yeah, it was a way to like build empathy and be like, hey, these were folks too. Like also looking at like, you could have gotten kicked out of the military if this happened. It was a social taboo. And yet people were willing to take those risks and connect with each other. And like thinking about like how strong those connections were to take those risks. And it was a pretty fun lesson. The summative actually was students was to make an artifact on like look like we did like women, African Americans, Latinx Americans. Anyway, students had to choose like a group that we looked at, or maybe a different group that we didn't have time to cover because
Let me pause you right there. Did you
Okay.
all notice that Chris listed all those cultural groups that are listed in the Fair Ed Act in that one sentence there? I just want to point that out, that he just covered all of those. So thank you for doing that, Chris. Keep going.
That was on purpose.
Yeah,
Not really.
thank you.
I was just talking. What was I saying? Anyway, so the summative assessment, because I really like creative assessments as opposed to like writing an essay for me, was to create an artifact that would theoretically exist during World War II, of that counter narrative. So there were some kids. They were like a lot of kids chose LGBT people. And there were some questions where I'd be like, so why'd you choose this group? And this one kid was like, because I'm a lesbian and I want to like learn more about lesbians. And I'm like, that's cool. I didn't know that. And it's cool how kids are like so comfortable saying that now. But anyway, I got like propaganda posters. There were like Pride World War II style propaganda posters. We got movie posters of like, hey, here's a movie about like gay soldiers, like during World War II. And I got like a lot of love letters as well. They like made me tear up. I was like, you need to teach me your ways. So um it was really cool to kind of see kids kind of step into those shoes and kind of see um the resilience of these groups despite a lot of the oppression, discrimination, and the willingness they had to, you know, stand up for the country because World War II, lots of patriotism, all that stuff. In terms of pushback, it wasn't necessarily like, I don't want to, like, this is offensive to me pushback. It was more like, I feel weird about talking about this because we haven't really ever done this before, kind of pushback. So and these were like one-on-one conversations I had with kids. So there was, again, a great opportunity for self-reflection of like, so why do you feel uncomfortable about this? Like, what draws you to this topic in the first place, that like you want to talk about it, but like what's kind of holding you back? So it not only was an opportunity for kids to like learn about counter narratives, but also an opportunity for them to be like, to self-reflect and be like, why is it important that we explore these topics despite the discomfort, right? Despite the fact that we internalize a lot of the only correct way to talk about World War II is through dominant narratives. Like, why are we so like attached to that, you know, it's almost like not okay
Yeah,
to talk about these other groups.
right.
So, I mean, there are great conversations. I actually showed some of the stuff to the parents. I'm like, so these are what your kids are doing. They're not just playing video games during class, like they're doing great stuff. So yeah, it was distance learning. It was actually very successful.
Great.
So that was good.
So Olivia and Oliver, any pushback you got from any students or administrators or colleagues? And if so, how did you handle it? So Olivia, why don't you continue on with that question?
So I kind of take my teaching approach for LGBTQ history in 3 different ways. I teach social emotional learning type stuff, which is like safe space stuff, where it's kind of like general, or sometimes it has to be specific because I'm having an issue. And then I do normalizing type teaching, where I normalize talking about LGBTQ people, even when I'm not really like, maybe I'm going to mention a historic person who happens to be LGBTQ, but I'm not going to go into a whole lesson about them being LGBTQ. So I'll mention it. I never refrain from mentioning it. I talk about myself. I talk about other LGBTQ people to normalize it. And you'd be surprised how much that helps. Okay. Because I didn't really do that originally. And that's when I got most pushback. Then I backwards map and lesson plan with primary sources. And that's my main meat. But I have to like get them to the meat by like, you know, convincing them that it's okay to have the conversation. And I've received pushback from parents, administrators, colleagues. I've received pushback from everyone. Most of it though, I've received a lot of pushback from parents. I've had parents email my school before on the very first day of school trying to get their kids out of my class just because they saw me. I don't even know. I don't know what the conversation was, even with the kids. Distance learning was really hard for me, to be honest with you, in this realm, because like on my first day of school, like I do on any first day of school, I tell them about myself and I show them pictures of my life, and I'm gay and my life is very gay. I have a partner, you know, we have dogs and a Subaru. Like I have a very gay life. Okay. So like I show them pictures. This was first day of school, did not even teach any LGBTQ history. And I had parents calling the school saying that I was a lesbian who was teaching their kids, I'm at school, sorry about that, lesbian teaching their kids about being gay. And that and get this, the real one that I got the most pushback for this year was that I believe that Black Lives Matter. And I was like, do you not? This is my question. Do you not? What is the alternative here? I got a lot of pushback from that. And, you know, this year, now I've been at this school. This is my 5th year at this school. They know me. They know they get calls about me. And so they don't tell me as much about them, which I appreciate. But my administrator was like, it's not illegal to be gay. And she's not making the kids say Black Lives Matter. She's telling them, hey, this is my personal opinion. Feel free to have your own. And that's how I always teach, because I'm careful. I never refrain from saying I believe Black Lives Matter or I believe that gay is good. I always just say, I'm not telling you got to be gay. Like, that's not how gay works. I And you know what, I've
Wait,
actually,
before you leave that administrator piece. So it sounds like part of what you've done is help to educate your administrator to just say, here's the reasons it's okay. And so that they know what to say to parents in the future.
yeah, and I have a little bit more to say on that. So still on the parent part. So my administrator, and I'll talk about this a little bit, but I've had this almost the same administrator for most of my high school teaching. And this year during distance learning was super hard for me. The parents are seeing everything. They're hearing me talking. Children are way more accepting than their parents, period. Even homophobic kids are more accepting usually than their parents. And I had several students who are LGBTQ coming to me for support, and I just got totally attacked, like, by parents all year long. Like, I was getting emails from parents, I was getting calls. One of them just like almost crushed me. I had to like take a couple days off and be like, all right, you can't control the situation. It's outside of your hands, because I had a student who was very much in the closet transgender, who had never even told anybody but me before. We were having email conversations because that's the only way we had, and their parents read every single email they sent to me. And I didn't say anything illegal, didn't do anything illegal. I sent this kid counseling services. We talked, the kid even asked me, am I transgender? And I was like, I can't answer that question for you. I cannot answer that question for you. All I can do is give you resources and tell you that, if you are, that I'm here for you, that I understand your struggle, that I'm in the trans umbrella and I can like help get you resources. But the parents, oh my God, I got the worst email I have ever received. That was humiliating for me and for the student. The student then comes to school and tells me that the parents made him read some of the emails out loud to them. It was really humiliating. And my administrator supported me. They basically told me, don't even respond to the email. Don't talk to these parents ever again. Ignore them. They have no legal standing. They can't tell you to stop talking to their kid, because they told me, don't talk to my kid again. I'm like, they're in my class. So that was kind of hard. This year was hard. But that was because of the uniqueness of this year for me and where I live. And my students were struggling. My LGBTQ students were struggling, and they knew that they could reach out to me because I made sure that they knew that I was the person they could reach out to. My administrators, and most of the time students are great. I had some students who will say like, oh, I'm not going to be in class because I don't want to hear about this, but then they don't leave. I tell them, I'm like, go ahead, ditch class. I'll just put you as ditched class. Like, if you want to take that consequence for not being in class, like, that's on you. But that has never actually happened. I've just gotten threats. Usually they just go home and I guess tell their parents, so their parents will complain about me. And my administrators have had a lot of growth, like I said. When I first started working, I was closeted because I really didn't trust them. Those of you who are in the room that are not part of the LGBTQ community, I want to say this loud and clear. None of us in the LGBTQ community assume that you're supportive, ever. I do not assume anyone I meet is supportive. I don't even assume a person in the LGBTQ community is supportive of me, because there's even parts of my identity that some people disagree with, even though that doesn't make sense. But, and so to me, it's vitally important as colleagues, as teachers, to make it clear to students and to your colleagues that you support them. I'll say this too. When I came out, I had great coworkers like Aleda, who's in the room, who like hugged me and told me she loved me, and we had a great conversation. And now we share resources. And I've had coworkers that don't talk to me anymore. They just don't talk to me. Or coworkers say, I'm not going to teach this in my classroom. And I say, okay, well, it's the law. So someday you could get sued. So just so you know that, I'll just put that out there. But of course, it's your classroom. But my administrator has said very unprofessional things to me before. Like one time he told me, of course the kids come to you. You look like a lesbian. And I was like,
wow.
But I've taught him, you can't say that to me. I know that you're trying to say like, I love lesbians. You look like one, but you really can't say that. That's not the appropriate, you're my boss, not the appropriate kind of place to say that kind of thing. Let's not make jokes about LGBTQ people, even if you think you're not making fun of them. And now I've become kind of a resource for him. So anytime we have any like transgender students on campus that have specific accommodation needs, like bathroom needs or name change, I am CC'd on the emails because they always want to double check. Hey, Olivia, does this make sense? Like recently we had a non-binary student who changed their name from a masculine name to another masculine name, and the administrator didn't want to approve it. He was like, that doesn't make sense. Doesn't that mean that they're transgender? So they're changing their gender? And I was like, no. It's more complicated than that, and kind of had to educate him. And in the end, he didn't understand it. But I just said, you don't have to understand this to know that this is the law. and this student is asking you to change it, you don't need to understand it. I want you to just trust me on this. And if you get in trouble, feel free to call me, because you won't. And he did change it. So you just kind of, you have to teach some people. And I hate being brave. I hate being courageous. I hate having to teach people that should already know this, but I will. And the best thing you can do on your campus is to get more people who want to do this work, so that you're not doing it alone, because it's really exhausting if you are, especially if you're in a conservative area. It feels like everything gets dropped on you, from like, this kid just came out and the counselor doesn't know how to deal with it, to we want to put up pride flags, to this kid's getting bullied by their teacher. And all of it will come to you if you're not careful. So you really have to get other people in on this and educate the administrators, educate your peers. Even if it's as small as being like, hey, I don't know that much about this either, but I know that what you just said probably wasn't good. So let's sign up for a conference together. Let's go to CTA's conference for LGBTQ people. Let's, explore, because most people in education, and I won't say all people, because there's some evil people in education, but most people in education really want to help the kids, and they just don't know how. They don't understand our community. And I always tell people, you don't have to understand this community. You're not in it. I am not Black. I don't understand the Black community. That doesn't mean I can't teach about Black history and the importance of Black people in American history and in world history and their experiences, using their own voices through primary sources. That's why I always say, I'm like, oh, you feel like you can't talk about this? Use a primary source, because, these people have talked about themselves. So I just encourage you, if you get pushback, remember, this is good trouble. Like, you're going to get in trouble in your life for things as a teacher, right? That you're like, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Like that one time I put on a movie and forgot there was a sex scene. Like, Schindler's List. Has anybody ever watched that? Yeah, you'll forget. There's a sex scene in Schindler's List, and trust me, all the kids will notice. Okay, that happened to me my first year of teaching. That was a trouble that I got in, and I was like, dang it, I shouldn't do that again. When I've gotten talked to before for teaching about LGBTQ history, I go home and maybe I'm upset that I got called out or whatever, but in the end, I know why. I know my why. I know why I'm doing it. I know who I'm doing it for, and I'm not doing it for my principal. So he can be upset. I'm not doing it for those parents. They can be upset. In the end, I want their kids to be more empathetic to LGBTQ people, and I want them to know history that's real. I'm not making any of this up. I'm not making up history to make LGBTQ people look better. This is all real. It happened. So why not talk about it?
Thank you.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah.
Actually, I'd like to give Oliver a chance. So we've only got 15 more minutes of the three of you here. And I've got other questions I really want to get to. But I want Oliver to get a chance to react to the pushback question. And then Oliver, if you could move into how you integrate LGBTQ history in your curriculum in an ongoing way.
Yeah, and Chris, feel free to interrupt me. I won't go too far into. I think Olivia did a lot there. I think the biggest thing is showing that the students want it, because no one, and I know Olivia and Chris already mentioned this, but everyone wants to support students. They just don't know how. Ask the students how, have a good relationship with them, have them be comfortable with you, let them tell you what you want, and support them advocating with the administration. I mean, that's what I've done a lot of at my school, is built student support and student-centered advocacy and curriculum. So what do you want to learn about? What can I research? How do you want to change sex ed at our school? I mean, all these questions have been student-led conversations that I kind of host in my GSA.
So I'm going to lead you back to the LGBTQ history piece. Okay.
Okay,
And let me just stop a minute and just say to all of us, we know that there are safe space climate stuff we could talk about and how to create that in our classrooms. But the purpose of this institute is talking about LGBTQ history and how we teach it in our classrooms. So if you could lead us back that way, Oliver, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I can absolutely go there. And I think the history part, I'm always connecting students' advocacy to historical advocacy. In terms of integrating queer history, and I'll try to be pretty quick, so save time for questions. I really I don't want students to romanticize and ultimately turn the queer history into some sort of normative history of acceptance and inclusion and tolerance. And I really like to get at the root of why are people oppressing folks, and how do folks liberate themselves, and how do they resist? Resistance, liberation, and joy, not just oppression. And I think that's what we all focus on. When was sexuality criminalized? The Supreme Court cases, blah, blah, blah. That's all amazing history. And I love, doing Masterpiece Cake Shop and the Colorado Commission of Human Rights, and talking about marriage and freedom of speech. I love playing devil's advocate and saying, arguing the other side, and being that queer teacher who's like, no, gays shouldn't be married. Oh my God, absolutely not. And, I think sometimes we need to play those roles in order to have those difficult conversations and surprise students. And I know I'm saying that as, having a safe way to listen to what the actual arguments are from folks that are homophobic. And if you can show up in that space and say, well, what are people really arguing when they argue X against, queer lives, I think is super important. Another thing.
Have you gotten pushback from parents or from administrators? And if so, how do you handle that?
I've consistently been trying to change the sex ed at my school. Definitely got a lot of pushback. I fought until the point where I kind of almost got fired.
But what does fought look like? In other words, I think what the people here want to hear is, what are the things that you've done to educate your administrators so that they better understand the reason for doing what you do?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is supporting with individual students. I mean, a student that comes out as trans and being the liaison for that student with the administration, because the administration doesn't know anything or how to do that. Working with parents to have that conversation when they're like, well, I don't know if this is just a phase. And you're like, well, gender and sexuality is a fluid process, and you have to just let your student kind of explore that, and whether or not this is something that's, it's not going to be a fixed situation. I'm rambling now, but I think it really comes back to having like.
But wait, let me go. I'm going to push back a little bit here and say, you said earlier, because I fight. Okay. And we heard Olivia say the same thing. The question becomes, what does that fight look like? Now, I heard you all say, I talk to individual students. Okay, I got that. But when an administrator says, hey, we got a phone call on this, what do you say back to them? What do you do to educate your administrators in an ongoing way, or in a response to pushback from a parent?
Like, I see Christopher's hands up. I have really great relationships with my parents where I make phone calls to them pretty regularly. And so I think that's a really important thing where people can trust me to be, I say that I'm a political and personal teacher, and there's no such thing as an apolitical, apersonal teacher. And making the argument that, that we necessarily understand and learn through ourselves and through our own positionality is how I sort of like intellectually make that argument and talk to parents and intimidate dads who work in finance jobs who think that they can come in and tell us what to do. But I think it is really important to have a vocabulary of how you approach this work and how it's attached to your pedagogy, because
Great.
Parents, yeah.
No, so that's all right. So there's a practical thing, is that you understand the content and you have the right words in which you share that with people. And I'm going to suggest the more you do that, the easier it gets. Go ahead, Chris.
I'll focus on the parent part. So I do a lot of really heavy front loading of parent-student relationships at the beginning of the school year. I do like a welcome email the day before the first day of school with like, hey, this is what's up. Back to school night. Back to school night's basically like marketing. Like, this is my curriculum. This is what we're doing. This is why it's exciting. This is why it's important. Here are my credentials. These are the schools my kids ended up going to. I just hype it up, right? I hype up what I'm about, and the parents get really excited. And then I slip in the end, like, I'm also the Queer Straight Alliance advisor. I'm the LGBTQ district liaison. I am the site lead for sex ed, because like, you can't hate someone for like, after they've like proven to you that they're a good teacher, you know? Like if that's the deal breaker for parents, like that's a completely different issue. And I find that to be really effective. Like even if a parent disagrees with who I am or what I do at a personal level, at the end of the day, I am giving that child a good education, and I have proof that I have given children in the past a good education. So that's really helped prevent a lot of the awkward conversations that would have otherwise happened. Um, in terms of administrators, I mean, I'm in a district that's lucky where they have a someone at a district level focused on diversity and inclusion, and they have people, teachers who are the designated liaisons at every site to keep the school accountable. So I am that person at my school. So I'm very privileged in that respect. However, I was thinking about what Olivia said, and there's also a lot of emotional baggage that comes with that. Because yeah, when something comes up about a trans kid, gender neutral bathrooms, they CC me. And I'm like, bro, I'm in the middle of grading all these final papers and you're asking me about school policy. Like, but because I am that resource, like I find that to be really important. Um, so, I mean, I'm glad that folks are here because you are able to kind of get those answers to help. Because this is not just a struggle that LGBTQ educators have to educate their colleagues, it's also a struggle that educators of color have. Like, I've had white teachers be like, I don't know how to talk about like Black people in my class, but you're not white. So how do you talk about it's like the weirdest conversation. So there's so much emotional baggage that a lot of teachers from oppressed communities have that teachers from more privileged populations do not have. And that leads to burnout. So
Yes.
So one of the things I hear you all saying is that when you've got diversity and inclusion officers or people that profess to be working in that space, that we make sure that part of their responsibilities also includes the LGBTQ community. Sometimes we have to remind people that. Go ahead, Olivia.
I would say that the best advice I can give you for someone who's fighting for this in your school, in your district, is to never let the conversation end without bringing up LGBTQ students. So like I mentioned, Aleda and I were on a curriculum building team, and I've continued on that curriculum building team. She's doing other things in the history curriculum world. And every single time we meet to talk about building curriculum, I say, okay, what units do we have to work on, and where can we put an LGBTQ plus lesson, and how can we relate it to the rest of the module? So when you're teaching a module about freedom movements, it's easy to include that, okay? To put it in there, to talk about the narrative, to compare different movements. That's a great way you can do it. So always bring it up. When I'm talking to administrators, when I'm talking to parents, I always bring up the FAIR Act. Always.
Olivia or Oliver, go ahead.
I'll just chime in on that because I love to do textbook comparisons and analysis, looking at some of the like decent textbooks about LGBTQ history, and then how some of the existing textbooks that we have in Washington State represent that same history. I mean, they'll go so far as, I think a passage on Jane Addams absolutely erases their queerness. And in one textbook that the school uses, and so that's just one really simple trick on how to integrate like different kinds of lessons that turn students into looking at secondary texts, but also looking at education themselves. Students love criticizing textbooks. I haven't seen students read textbooks faster and be like, oh my God, this is terrible, and it's just it's a beautiful lesson for them to be aware of how this is all, any and all text has bias, and look, we can turn it into a literacy lesson. I think that was it. I guess I just wanted to say also, students love talking, and I'm going to say triggering words, but they love talking about language, the origins of faggot, right? We talk about the origins of the N-word, the uses of the N-word through history. Say the word faggot in class and talk about it as an academic historical artifact. It is one. it's used as such, and so is queer. And students want to know so badly. Otherwise, it's this taboo floating in the air that's like, oh my God, faggot, that's the worst. I say that with my friends, or I say gay, that's the worst. Unpack those concepts. Let that language be, known. And I don't know if maybe there's some disagreement here, and I would love to have a disagreement on this, but
I love bringing up the word faggot by looking at the primary source that says the faggots ball. That's my favorite one to bring that up. And I'm like, okay, so who's calling them faggots? Are they self-identifying as this? Is it a word that's used descriptively by other people? When is it okay in this context to use this word? Why are these people using this word? It's a great way to talk about the evolution of words. And
reclaiming culture.
Yeah.
That really fits in the Harlem Renaissance for anybody who wanted to know where that fits. Chris, go ahead.
This is also what Oliver said reminds me of, I did something similar where we looked at primary sources focused on hate speech and the pros and cons. And then to practice academic speech, we had a Socratic seminar in which students use the text as a basis to kind of build on each other, not necessarily I agree with this or I disagree with this, but building an argument based on the primary text that they read and they took notes on. So not only is that a good way to kind of confront the social taboos of this vocabulary, it's also, if we're talking about meeting the standards, an opportunity for students to practice academic conversations. So, that's also a strategy to incorporate into your curriculum and into your practice, if that's something you're interested in.
What I hear you all saying is the level of interest among your students seems to increase as you deal with these topics or talk about these various topics.
Part of me actually thinks that lots of students have interest in this. They just do not feel like the classroom is an appropriate place to talk about it because schools have taught children, just like you were saying, can I say the word gay? Kids are convinced that it's a bad word because we talk about gay people in hushed tones. They probably have an uncle or an aunt who has a roommate and they're like, her friend. And so when their family talks about it like that, it makes it a little bit harder. But once you start that's why I talked about one part of implementation of curriculum is normalizing the language. And you can have a conversation about what's appropriate. I think Todd maybe mentioned, talking about having that conversation about queer. So a lot of older generation people don't like the word queer because it was used against them as a slur. And a lot of younger people like the word queer. And that's great. Both of those things are true. What a great conversation to have about that. And there doesn't have to be a right answer. I tell kids that all the time. In history, there's rarely ever a right answer. And if you think you're right, someone in 5 years is going to come to tell you that you're wrong. So it's okay to have a conversation about these words just for the sake of having a conversation about them, because it plants a seed in them to start thinking about these things themselves. Often students who are cisgender never think about gender. They just don't, unless they're thinking about attraction or what they're not. And so by encouraging students to think about gender, you're really encouraging them not to question their gender, but to think about the way gender interacts with themselves and their own life and in history and what gender means in society. So you don't have to have conversations even about sexuality to be talking about this topic. The best you can do for your students, just really quickly, I want to give some advice because I got pulled out of class for this and I have to go back, but is empower your students. I just had an LGBTQ teaching summit in Bakersfield that I helped put on that was amazing. There was 70 people there. And one of the teachers afterwards emailed me to tell me that she used some of the resources that I made about not using the phrase "that's so gay" to mean I hate that, and she told me that one of her fifth graders came up to her after the lesson and was like, wow, I just want to let you know that I'm LGBTQ. And that was really amazing. And I would like to make a lesson about LGBTQ people and present it to the class, a fifth grader. Okay. And they were empowered by the teacher telling them that their voice matters and that no one in this classroom is allowed to degrade them just by that simple conversation. How incredible that is. Empower your students, because what we want is queer people, more queer people in education. We want more queer people in every field that there is, and for it to be normalized. So empower your students. always focus on your students and their needs, and don't worry so much about the parents, because the law protects you. The FAIR Act protects you. As long as you're having conversations about history and you're using academic language, the FAIR Act protects you. And don't be afraid to have tough conversations with students. And because students, they might actually know more about this than you think that they do. They might be educating you a little bit. And those are my big advice pieces for that.
Great. So any other final words you want to share, Olivia? Then we'll go to Oliver and Chris to kind of give any final words of wisdom or final words of advice. Anything else, Olivia, before you leave?
One thing I would just love to say is I posted my resource guide. I know I've kind of said that a handful of times, but it took me so long to make. So I would love it if somebody used it. I made an entire matrix for every year in school in the FAIR Act and what you could teach in it with links to lessons. Some of them are lessons that I've made with our Family Coalition and One Archives, and some of them are ones that I've made by myself. Others are ones that other people made. So please check that out. And I highly suggest if there's a topic in queer history that you're like, I don't really know that much about it, listen to a podcast while you drive. Learn about it. I mean, there are people out there who would love to give you their hard-earned work for free. So take it.
Thanks. And just know that Olivia's guide, I've added to our agenda list of resources, as I will other things that everybody's sharing. So thanks, Olivia. Oliver, to you, final words of wisdom, advice, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think my final thoughts, I don't have a ton of wisdom. I was thinking about this. We've talked around a lot of the idea of normalizing, queerness, and I'm using the term queerness just generally broadly. But I also want to be careful on what normalizing means. And when we talk about normalization, I don't want to be like straight people. I don't at all. I'm sorry.
I don't want to be normal.
Yeah, I don't want to be normal. I don't want to be normalized. I'm not trying to be like that. So I think I complicate that because we aren't just like everybody else. And I think it's really important to make sure that we're not trying to say, well, aren't these queer people amazing war heroes from the Vietnam War, and then ended at that? That's an incredibly difficult, incredibly complex and problematic thing to do, and the sort of pink washing and homonormativity that we sort of perpetuate by doing that is really dangerous and inauthentic to the queer community, I think.
Hey, Oliver, what I meant by normalizing was normalizing using the language in your classroom.
Yes. No, I didn't think you did. I just wanted to say it to complicate the concept of normalization. But I think my final thing is that just like when we're talking about ethnic studies and Blackness, critical race theory, which of course is now at the forefront of too many states' little battles, and we talk a lot about Blackness, but we don't talk enough about whiteness, and that's an obvious thing. We also don't talk enough about straight people or heterosexuality, and why heterosexuality, how heterosexuality shows up and how it shapes what queerness means and how queerness is oppressed. And so naming and noticing where heterosexuality shows up, the heteronormative family, the values that come with that, the heteronormativity, are so crucial, and how those are connected to the historical moment, whether that's reproducing capitalism, whatever you want to read into there, and how heterosexuality is essential for reproduction and growth and capital, etc. I think there's so much to be said about how heterosexuality shows up, and to do that in a queer way where we're critiquing and looking and speaking about that. Because if we're not talking about straightness and straight people, we're doing the same thing. We're talking about Black folks and we're not talking about whiteness. So I guess that's my parting message. And thank you all for having me. And Rob, thank you so much. And Olivia and Christopher, it was so nice meeting you all. Thanks.
Chris, final words, advice from you.
Something I recommend is don't just throw LGBT people in your lesson and be like, cool, look, there's gay people, yay. Be very, make sure that acceptance manifests itself in the school itself. If you're talking about like, yeah, trans people are great, but there's no gender neutral bathrooms at your school, like, what's going on with that. So making sure to be very problem solving oriented, because content's content, but unless your views and that content is able to show itself at school, at the very least in terms of facilities, then what are we really doing? So do keep that in mind, that if you're not just a resource for kids learning about LGBTQ issues, like they may be like, thank you for teaching that. I am this way and this is what I'm dealing with. So be prepared for that emotional baggage, possibly.
Great. Please join me in putting your best hands forward or your reactions to thank Chris, Olivia, and Oliver for, as you can tell, their passionate belief and practices in this world. So thanks, you guys. Look, I just did you guys, and I shouldn't be doing that, but I caught myself. Anyway, thanks, everybody. We're going to take a break. We will reconvene at 10:55. When we come back, if you could make sure that your Zoom name has a number in front of it. I just put the link to the group in front of there. And again, thanks everybody. And thank you again to Oliver, Olivia, and Chris. Break time.